when what we call true crime began, most of them would say the 20th century. If they know of Truman Capote's landmark book, In Cold Blood, published in 1966, they might date the beginning of the genre more precisely. But even if they don't know of Capote, my sense is that most people would think of true crime as a distinctly modern phenomenon. Are they right? Well, yes and no. If by true crime we mean a genre that markets itself under that name, that exists as a category recognized and promoted by publishing houses, and that focuses largely on celebrity cases, famous historical cases, cold cases, and serial killers, then yes, true crime is more or less a modern phenomenon. But if by true crime we're referring to fact-based narratives with crime at their center, narratives that claim to be factual but actually use a variety of fictional techniques, and narratives that are designed to instruct and entertain their audience, well, that type of true crime goes back hundreds of years. In this lecture, we'll discuss the precursors to the modern version of true crime by examining such materials as Puritan execution sermons, rogues' biographies, and newspaper coverage of crime. From this standpoint, we'll be able to construct a prehistory for true crime. But we'll also see how this genre draws on elements of mystery and suspense fiction while distinguishing itself by emphasizing its factual objective status. Our story begins in Puritan New England, and I'm well aware that this seems like a counterintuitive starting point. Surely the Puritans had their minds fixed too firmly on what it took to get to heaven to be concerned with crime here on earth. In fact, Puritan-era America was just as obsessed by the acts, trials, and executions of criminals as we are today. It's just that their interests necessarily took different forms. And one of these forms was not only reading about crimes, but also attending executions. Public hangings aroused tremendous popular interest, and the audiences for executions reportedly constituted some of the largest public gatherings in the Puritan era. Not surprisingly, Puritan ministers seized the opportunity to instruct the crowds attending these events about the proper way to view the criminal's demise. Clergymen typically delivered sermons on capital cases on the Sunday before the sentence was to be carried out, or very often on the day of the execution itself. By all accounts, these sermons were often as well attended as the executions themselves, and the fact of their subsequent publication and distribution made them extremely influential and well-known documents that obviously had a strong religious flavor. For example, in 1675, an influential Puritan minister by the name of Increase Mather preached an execution sermon in Boston entitled The Wicked Man's Portion that is very representative of the genre. The message to be drawn from the execution of the criminal is spelled out very clearly in the sermon's subtitle, wherein is showed that excess in wickedness doth bring untimely death. Below this subtitle appear biblical passages that drive the message home even more firmly. In this case, Mather chose Proverbs chapter 10, verse 27. The fear of the Lord prolongeth days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. And Ephesians chapter 6, verses 2 to 3. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. This use of biblical passages to underline the message of the execution sermons is typical of what I would call the pedagogic dimension of these sermons, a dimension that can also be found in contemporary examples of true crime. Some of the lessons are explicit. This is what will happen to you if you commit this crime. And some are implicit. Our community is defined by certain values, and this is what we do to those who violate those values. The Bible passages also enabled the sermon's reader to later use it at home as a kind of study guide. Considering that the Bible was very likely the only book in many Puritan homes, the reference to Bible verses on both the front page and in the margins of these sermons made them a very useful resource for parents to educate and perhaps frighten their children. In a wonderful book entitled Murder Most Foul, historian Karen Haltunen has argued that the doctrine of original sin played a profoundly important role in determining Puritan attitudes toward the criminal, and the influence of this doctrine can be detected in execution sermons. She writes, "The effect of the execution sermon's treatment of criminal causality was to establish a strong moral identification between the assembled congregation and the condemned murderer. For the doctrine that the root of crime was innate depravity undercut any notion of the murderer's moral peculiarity, with all humankind bound in that original sin committed by the first parents of the race." Unlike many contemporary examples of true crime, execution sermons did not present the criminal as some type of monstrous outsider. Rather, in the sermons, the criminal is seen as a representative member of the community, precisely because he or she has sinned. In fact, one could argue that criminals were model citizens of the Puritan community, because by sinning, confessing that sin, and then asking for God's forgiveness, they dramatize the process of conversion and redemption. Thanks to the efforts of the Puritan ministers, execution sermons were enormously popular. We know this partly because their publishers used them to advertise their other products, because they knew that these sermons reached a large and diverse audience. Products advertised included another publication from Increase Mather entitled The Folly of Sinning, and a history of King Philip's War, which took place between 1675 and 1676. The ad notes that the latter is sold by Samuel Phillips at the brick shop near the townhouse in Boston. Another index of the popularity of execution sermons is that collections of these sermons and other narratives started to be published, making up a sort of greatest hits of the genre, as it were. Pillars of Salt, published in 1699, is an early example of this type of collection and was written by Cotton Mather, who was even more influential than his famous father, Increase Mather. Like the earlier sermons, the subtitle of Pillars of Salt gives a very descriptive summary of the volume's contents, so the customer knows exactly what he's getting for his hard-earned money. An history of some criminals executed in this land for capital crimes, with some of their dying speeches, collected and published for the warning of such that live in destructive courses of ungodliness. Note that this subtitle also indicates the spirit in which this volume is meant to be read. Even in these very early days, it seems, it was important to provide the reader with a justification for reading true crime. The best-known collections of execution sermons and other early true crime narratives appear a little later, in the middle of the 18th century. The first was called the Newgate Calendar. It first appeared in England in the 1740s and was originally a monthly bulletin of executions that took place at the Newgate prison in London. Thanks to the popularity of this bulletin, the title was taken up and used by a number of publishers. These later versions included true, that is, highly embellished, accounts of the lives of famous criminals, such as the highwayman Dick Turpin and the pickpocket and fence Moll Cutpurse. This format proved to be so popular that it was reprinted and revamped dozens of times, all the way through to the 20th century. Its American equivalent was the American Bloody Register, first published in 1784. It was enormously popular, mainly because it stuck to the tried and tested format introduced by the Newgate calendar. You'll look in vain for any biblical references on the title page of the Bloody Register, but you will learn that it contains a true and complete history of the loves, last words, and dying confessions of 3 of the most noted criminals that have ever made their exit from a stage in America. The phrasing here is fascinating because it suggests that the focus of the narrative is on the fame, or notoriety if you prefer, of these criminals. Moreover, the reference to a stage, by which they mean the scaffold, implies a full awareness of the public execution as a spectacle, and a spectacle whose primary purpose is now to entertain rather than instruct. These collections demonstrate that the criminal was an object of sympathy and compassion, as well as revulsion and punishment. By emphasizing the dangerously thin line that separated the criminal from the spectator, Puritan ministers used execution sermons to reassert their cultural, spiritual, and political authority. And by arguing that every member of the community was subject to the withdrawal of God's grace at a moment's notice, clergymen had a powerful argument for why their congregations should let themselves be guided by the Puritan ministerial elite. This control turned out to be inherently unstable, however, precisely because it required generating a certain amount of public sympathy for the criminal. It could be argued that there's something intrinsic in true crime narratives that generates sympathy for the criminal. There's certainly a very obvious sense in which such narratives are always about the criminal rather than the victim. Up to a point, this feature of crime narratives served the purposes of the Puritans well, because a certain degree of identification with the criminal was necessary for the ideological message of the execution sermons to be effective. But even when Puritan control of crime narratives seemed absolute, there was concern about an inappropriate kind or degree of public sympathy. This concern turned out to be justified because there's a significant difference between the later narratives and the earlier execution sermons. The new element is an interest in the lives of the criminals themselves, an interest that goes beyond the earlier Puritan emphasis on these individuals as representatives. Instead, this new emphasis is on the exceptional nature of the criminal. And they are exceptional not only in the sense of being uniquely wicked or evil, but also in the sense of being uniquely entertaining, dashing, even admirable. This shift indicates that our attitudes towards criminals are never simply condemnation or revulsion, but also fascination and even sympathy. As long as the Puritans maintained strict control over the production of these narratives, the dangers of sympathy for the criminal could be contained. But the effects of the sermons are unpredictable. While it's entirely possible that the audience for sermons did indeed tremble at the thought of being sinners in the hands of an angry God, it's also possible they identified with the criminal in a way that ministers would have found most troubling. As Puritan influence over American society began to weaken in the late 17th century, other forms of true crime narrative began to appear that both exemplified and intensified that weakening. Significantly, these new forms of crime narrative all gave criminals the opportunity to present their side of the story in their own voice. As the social and religious background of criminals changed, and it became less and less likely for them to have been born and raised as Puritans, these criminal narratives also became increasingly secular. Whereas information about the criminals had once constituted a fairly minor part of execution sermons, now more and more lives, dying speeches, and final warnings were published as separate documents, having been liberated, as it were, from their sermonic context. And as the decline in Puritan authority accelerated, more and more crime narratives were written in a realistic style, including detailed attention to the events leading up to the murder and information about the private lives of the protagonists. These changes contributed to the development of a celebrity culture organized around the criminal that culminated in what became known as rogues' biographies, where criminality was seen almost as an admirable expression of unbridled personality. The tone of these biographies is quite different from that of the execution sermons. They're more sensational, and they also tend to characterize the murderers as monsters. Critic Daniel Williams has noted that these changes in crime narratives were influenced by the development of Enlightenment concepts of freedom, concepts that gradually replaced the doctrine of original sin. According to Williams, self-determination, self-reliance, and self-initiative all become socially dominant ideals in the 18th century. As he explains, after the Revolution, after the country had itself defied authority, descriptions of deviant and defiant individuals became especially popular in American literature, and the criminal, the clever rogue in particular, became both hero and anti-hero, both epitome and parody of the American character. As a literary figure, the criminal moved from Puritan condemnation to post-revolutionary celebration. But although these new understandings of the relation between self and community impacted the content and character of 18th century crime narratives, I don't want to give the impression that these new types of criminal narrative celebrated criminality. If there was any celebration of criminality at all, it still had very definite limits. With the declining influence of the doctrine of original sin, it suddenly became much more difficult to explain the actions of criminals, especially when they seemed to violate what the Enlightenment saw as the innate goodness and rationality of humans. Karen Haltunen has argued that Americans struggled to come up with an explanation for criminality that was as intellectually satisfying as the concept of original sin. This problem, she says, was especially acute when considering those types of crime where the concepts of environmental influence, motive, or uncontrolled passion as reasons for crime just didn't seem to explain the circumstances of the crime. As Haltunen explains, a significant number of murder narratives printed between 1750 and 1820 demonstrated the inadequacy of all these attempts to explain the crime, as some men and women murdered against character, or from an inexplicable compulsion to kill, or in cold-blooded insensibility. These crimes challenged the prevailing rational view of human nature. The answer to the dilemma posed by these inexplicable crimes was to make a virtue out of necessity and heighten the air of mystery surrounding them by using the language of Gothic fiction. In particular, the notion of monstrosity assumed a prominent role in crime narratives. As Haltunen explains, the image of the murderer as monster expressed the incomprehensibility of murder within the rational Enlightenment social order. So this is why these new types of true crime narratives are not only more sensational, but also tend to characterize the criminals as monsters, placed explicitly outside of society by the crimes they've committed. Whereas Puritans made great efforts to keep criminals integrated into Puritan society, these later sources see criminals as social misfits and outsiders, partly because they lacked a compelling explanatory framework that would help them to make sense of the worst of these criminals. I want to emphasize, however, that the concept of monstrosity didn't simply replace the concept of representativeness as an explanation of criminality. Rather, monstrosity and representativeness continue to coexist as a way of addressing the public ambivalence about criminals, an ambivalence that comes from our sense that criminals like murderers are in an obvious sense so very different from ordinary people, and yet in another sense they seem disturbingly like us. It's worth emphasizing that you can see examples of this ambivalence in contemporary examples of true crime. Think, for example, of true crime books about serial killers, in which the killers are presented simultaneously as monsters and as neighbors you'd never suspect, and you'll see what I mean. Representations of violence in true crime narratives, both early and contemporary, consistently try to make sense of this duality at the heart of our feelings about violent criminals by changing and adapting as our society as a whole changes. This is a key reason for the enduring popularity of these narratives, and it's also why true crime provides us with such a great window into what makes American society tick. So, there was more sensationalism and a greater emphasis on monstrosity in true crime narratives beginning in the 18th century. But, as my earlier reference to Gothic fiction suggested, there was also a greater use of fictional elements, and this change took place for a couple of reasons. First, unlike the original execution sermons, which were pretty much only read by people who had seen the actual execution, and which therefore had to be fairly accurate, later examples of true crime narrative could afford to be more creative and twist the facts a little bit. After all, they were distributed over a wider geographical area to people who hadn't witnessed the actual execution. But also, and this is the second point, the later narratives needed to be more creative. Fictional elements assumed a greater importance because these later narratives place a greater emphasis on entertaining rather than instructing, on thrilling readers rather than sending them to specific passages in the Bible. What we start to see in the 18th and 19th centuries, then, are true crime narratives that are much more upfront about explicitly combining entertainment and moral precepts. But this is not to say that it was necessarily easy to manage the combination. For example, the preface to a bound collection of crime narratives published in 1812 under the title The Criminal Recorder, or An Awful Beacon to the Rising Generation of Both Sexes, illustrates the sorts of contradictions or tensions this combination could bring about. The preface begins by recommending the narratives as suitably cautionary tales of guilt and punishment, adding that adults would find them useful in steering their children away from crime. However, perhaps concerned that this impeccably moral reason for purchasing the collection made it sound too dull, the preface then goes on to say, "Let it not be hastily supposed by the gay and youthful that this volume is a dull or canting lecture upon religion and morals." Although this combining of moral lesson and thrilling entertainment might seem almost paradoxical, it shows that 19th century true crime narratives aimed to reach quite a diverse audience, including the old and the young, traditionalists and freethinkers, so they needed to present themselves in a variety of ways. I also want to emphasize that this ability of true crime to adapt itself to the needs and desires of a large number of different audiences is another reason for its success. Like mystery and suspense fiction as a whole, true crime from its earliest stages has been very sensitive to the need for niche marketing. We can see the same combination of variety, sensation, and marketing in the rise of newspaper reporting about murder, which started to emerge in the 19th century. Although, as we have seen, there are many examples of American true crime narratives dating all the way back to colonial times, it might surprise you to know that journalistic coverage of crime was a fairly late arrival on the scene. There had been some early attempts to bring the American public coverage of homicides, along with other strange and shocking occurrences, as with the American Magazine of Wonders of 1809. But these were more almanacs than examples of journalism. Their range was very broad, as we can see by the fact that they carried reports about sea monsters, exotic customs from foreign lands, and animal deformities, and the murders they covered had usually taken place a number of years before and usually outside of the United States. Newspapers had traditionally paid very little attention to crime, not only because they didn't want to waste precious space reporting on events they thought people would already have heard about through other publications, but also because they were constrained by a sense of delicacy and civic responsibility. This all changed with the explosion of the penny press in the mid-1830s. The most famous penny newspaper of the day was the New York Herald, published by James Gordon Bennett. Bennett was a shrewd businessman, and he knew that nothing sold more newspapers than hideous crimes. As he once put it, American readers were more ready to seek 6 columns of the details of a brutal murder than the same amount of words poured forth by the genius of the noblest author of our times. Bennett was more than happy to give the public what they wanted, providing detailed and extremely graphic coverage of the most infamous murders of the time. From the mid-1830s onward, crime news became a staple of newspaper coverage. It was easy and cheap to gather. It was already familiar to readers who were avid consumers of the other forms of true crime narrative that we've been looking at, and it was easy for newspapers to argue they were performing a civic duty, namely, warning their readers about the dangers of the rapidly expanding American cities. There again, we see the pedagogic dimension of true crime that I mentioned earlier. During this period, newspaper coverage of murder took off thanks to the occurrence of highly marketable crimes, such as the murders of prostitute Helen Jewett in 1836 and of shopgirl Mary Rogers in 1841, the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Mystery of Marie Roget. Of course, the popular press then, as now, also came in for a lot of criticism for being excessively sensational. But like it or not, the popular press, or yellow press as it came to be known, was here to stay. It was the great-grandparent, as it were, of the tabloid newspapers and television shows of today. The success of the popular press came partly from the fact that it was able to satisfy the desires of its consumers so well, but it was also the result of such factors as rapidly growing urban populations, rising literacy rates, and increasingly efficient networks of production and distribution for printed materials. All of these factors created a new and very large market for burgeoning forms of popular culture that all had their fingers on the pulse of public demand. In this market, certain criminal cases quickly became cause célèbre. The case I'd like to focus on is the murder of Mary Rogers, because it was one that fascinated Poe. The Rogers case took place in 1841, the same year Poe published The Murders in the Rue Morgue. In her book, The Mysterious Death of Mary Rogers, historian Amy Gilman Srebnick comments that were it not for the newly developed concept of public news and the recent emergence of a reading public craving sensation from the penny press, the story and the mystery of Mary Rogers would probably have gone almost unnoticed. But, according to Srebnick, Rogers's life and death occurred at the very moment that a new urban and commercial written culture was taking shape. The newspaper, the dime novel, the sensational pamphlet, and the magazine with its serialized stories were the places where the Rogers story was both created and popularized. As a result, Srebnick argues, the murder of Mary Rogers not only became an emblematic crime in the way it linked female death, sexuality, and a peculiarly urban sense of mystery, but also ensured that crime reporting became a major aspect of popular journalism in America. Srebnick's remarks are fascinating because they indicate precisely how the early examples of true crime narratives that we've been looking at in this lecture overlap with the genre of mystery and suspense fiction. Depending on the writer and the intended audience, the same sensational crime could provide the raw material for a newspaper article, a true crime narrative that combined a factual basis with fictional elements drawn from the Gothic, or Edgar Allan Poe's The Mystery of Marie Roget. There could be no better example of why it's so important to study these early forms of true crime narrative. They give us a sense of the context out of which contemporary true crime emerged, while also suggesting that the traffic between fact and fiction in mystery and suspense fiction has always traveled in both directions.